assured that the U.S. will support them in a particular conflict, which means that they don't have to spend a lot on their own military as a result. So it politically reassures them. And those are probably the two major goals that are associated with presence in the topic literature. And I think that, that this interpretation is, there are definitely some arguments for why this is an accurate interpretation of the topic. Okay, the last definitional consideration that I want to talk about is, does military presence include private contractors, which seems to be, an area of concern, of question for a lot of people who read about this topic. Private contractors are not military forces, but we do have tons of private contractors in active combat zones. So, for example, in Iraq, the number of privately contracted military forces outnumbers the number of actual U.S. military forces in Iraq. So, are they included in the topic? I don't have a great answer to this, but I will give you a couple of considerations. Number one is that the topic says its military presence, which means that there are definitions of the word its that say that its means belonging to, so the military presence has to belong to the U.S. government. It is definitely true that private military contractors are not part of the U.S. military and they are not owned by the U.S. government. So I think there's one argument that says that private military contractors are not a part of the topic. In my opinion, I think that the affirmative interpretation that might say that they should be considered part of the topic is probably a little bit better for two reasons. Number one is that there is evidence that describes private military contractors as acting as agents of the federal government, so that even though they may not be part of its military, they are part of its military presence, which is more than just the military. It's the overall military policy to deter and or reassure. And under that particular interpretation, private military contractors fulfill the same function as official military forces and therefore are arguably a component of U.S. military presence. And number two, and this is a little bit complicated, is the problem of police presence. In order for the phrase its police presence to make sense, if it means that it has to be owned by or belonging to the United States federal government, in order for there to be actual police presence, you have to demonstrate that the United States federal government actually owns sizable police forces that are in any of the topic countries. And it technically does. It owns military police. So if the topic is just about military police and not any civilian police, then then arguably there's no reason why the word police is in the topic to begin with. But the U.S. does have small amounts of civilian police in a couple of the topic countries, and all of those police forces operate under private contracts. So in order for police presence to make sense as a term of art in the resolution, you really probably have to think that private contractors are parts of overall U.S. federal government presence. So I think there is definitional support to support the claim that the topic probably includes private contractors or could include private contractors. But having said that, there will definitely be a fairly involved debate over this particular question. Actually, the true last thing I'm going to talk about definitions is what constitutes a substantial reduction in presence. Substantially, usually on other topics, is a pretty poor limiting term. In other words, what is substantial to me is not substantial to you. I might think that reducing 3 people is substantial. You might think it requires reducing 30,000. And it's totally arbitrary. And in general, negatives almost never win debates by saying that the affirmative is not substantial. In my opinion, on this particular topic, substantially is quite a bit better than it has been on every topic. Substantially has been on every topic for the last 10 years, and Usually it's not a very good source for the negative. On this topic, it's quite a bit better. I'll just read to you the following definition, which comes from a U.S. law, which is, substantial reductions in the operations of a military installation shall be considered to have occurred if more than 50% of the personnel assigned to the installation have been reassigned. That is from a U.S. Base Closure Act. It is not the only definition of that particular term. There are several definitions that are in the context of U.S. law that actually define the word substantially in the context of particular military reductions. I have seen a card that I'll also give to you in this topicality file that says that a substantial reduction is 25% and so forth. So that is something to think about on the affirmative and to be concerned about on the affirmative. Like, I do think that military music teams from a matter of, or musical groups that from a matter of truth are part of U.S. military presence, but whether or not you can win that's a substantial reduction, I would guess you probably can. Okay. Questions about the meanings of terms? All right. You should feel free to stop me if you have any questions, but otherwise, I'll go on. Did you have a question?
Could you define logistics again, please?
Logistics is just the practice of moving and maintaining U.S. forces. So, the primary mission of U.S. forces is combat. There is a logistics division of the military that essentially provides supplies and provides transportation to the military to get them where they want to go. And logistics is I think, a huge part of the topic, which is why I defined it. Anything else? A private contractor is somebody who is paid by the military, who's a civilian. They are paid by the military to perform a particular task. So in Iraq, for example, we have a lot of the training mission that occurs in Iraq of Iraqi security forces occurs from private military contractors. A lot of the security details in Iraq, a lot of the logistics operations in Iraq are all carried out by private contractors. And usually private contractors are actually like military organizations that are made up of people who used to work in the military but now work for private organizations. But they still have guns, they're willing, they can defend themselves, they can sometimes engage in hostilities, things like that. So, in my opinion, it is probably topical to reduce private military contractors, but because we have more than twice as many contractors in Iraq as we have actual troops. But there's definitely going to be a debate about that. Okay.
So the private military contractors are directly paid by the U.S. military?
They are, which is why they act as agents of the U.S. government. Okay. The next section of my lecture is an explanation of U.S. military presence in terms of prior U.S. policy to it, what our current force deployments are in the particular topic countries, and some mechanisms to reduce the overall presence. A lot of this, I'm going to briefly talk about the history of military presence. You don't necessarily need to write a lot of this down. There is a very significant portion of this that you do need to write down. The beginning stuff is just kind of, I'm going to briefly detail some background because it's important to set up things that happened recently. And a lot of this comes from that same Catherine Lutz woman who is, she's qualified, she's a professor at Brown University, but some of her statistics, in my opinion, are a little bit sketchy and contradicted by other things that I've read. But